We're on Daled and Aleph, maybe a third to the bottom of the page. And at the beginning of the line, where it says V'chein begina, a quarter from the bottom. Okay, so the Gemara is quoting the Mishnah, and the Mishnah reads, V'chein begina, makom shenagol ligdar mechayven oisai. The same halacha applies to a garden. The same halacha of building a wall between two neighbors. And we already had a discussion in a previous Gemara about what this means, and so too in a garden. One way of understanding it was, and so too in a garden means that there's also hezek re'iyah, there's also the issue of damaging property. But the Gemara there rejected that and concluded, at least according to one opinion, concluded that when the Mishnah says v'chein begina, the same thing applies to a garden. It's not with regard to the law of damaging in terms of vision, at least not according to the other opinion, but the sameness, v'chein, between the two halachas is with respect to the type of wall you're making. And therefore, makom shenagol ligdar, in a place where the custom is to make a fence between gardens, mechayven oisai, they're obligated to do so. This is the Mishnah. So the Gemara now says like this. Hagufa kasha. This very line itself is perplexing. Amris, you first began by saying, V'chein begina, that the same halacha of building a wall between two properties applies to a garden, not just a yard, not just a chutzner. And what do you say? You say that the same thing applies to a garden in that makom shenagol ligdar, a place where the custom is to put up a fence, to put up a partition, mechayven oisai, we obligate them to build them. So the implication is HaStama, but if there is no custom, there's no local custom, not to build and not to build, not in the pro, not in the con, not in the positive, not in the negative. It's just a regular locale. It has no specific custom. So what would the implication be if you just read this line of the Mishnah? You would come to the conclusion, you're not obligated to build. Because the statement here says, Makam shenagol ligdar, a place where the custom is to be magdir, a place where the custom is to build a wall, that's when you build a wall. But if there is no custom, even some do, some don't, then he's not obligated. That would be implied if you're only to read this line. But the Gemara continues, Ema Seifa. Let us now consider the second clause. The next clause in the Mishnah is, quote from the Mishnah now, Aval Bika, but an open field, which is less private than a garden. Right? Yard is most private, most public, most private, Chatzer to Ginah, and then to Bika. Yard, garden, then open field. So Aval Bika, says the Mishnah, but a Bika, but an open field, Makim Shenagu Shaloi Ligdar, in a place where there's a custom not to build, then Ein Mechayven Oisai, he's not obliged to build. Because the only time you don't make them build is when there's no custom. I'm sorry, when there's a custom not to. There's a positive custom not to. Nagu Shaloi Ligdar, the custom is not to do so. Then Ein Mechayven Oisai, then you don't oblige him. The implication, therefore, from that statement would be Hastama, but if there is no custom, Mechayven Oisai, you do obligate them. So there's no contradiction here, but it's illogical, right? Because the first statement is Gina, garden. That in a garden, the only time you oblige someone to build a wall in a garden is when there's a positive custom to do so. Fine. If there's no custom, do as you wish. Whereas when it comes to Bika, we say, the only time we don't obligate you to build one is when there is a positive custom not to. But if there's no custom, then we do obligate you. So there's no contradiction, but the halacha would basically be somewhat irrational, because it would mean that in a garden, if there's no custom, no wall. In a field, no custom, yes wall. When seemingly a field is much less private and less of a reason for a wall than a garden. So even though it's not a contradiction in the Mishnah, but it's not a rational, doesn't seem like a rational set of laws. And this is how the Gemara plays it out. Hashta, now considering the first clause, where we've come to the conclusion, Stam Gina, an ordinary, a garden which has no custom. Amris, you say, I don't need to build one because there's no actual custom. I don't have to. Stam bika mibaya, then a bika which has no custom. You're telling me over there I do need to have a wall. Doesn't seem rational. Seemingly the bika, the open field, is less necessary to have a wall than a garden. And if the implication is that a garden, when there's no custom, does not need a wall, then why would by a bika when there's no custom I have to have a wall? Let's see the Rashi as he translates this. Rashi said, quote the Gemara, Hashta stam gina amris loi, apapi shehezek riyasa kasha. Even though the hezek ri'iyah in a garden is worse than the hezek of a bika. Is this only according to the opinion of hezek ri'iyah? I don't think so. I think it's even according to the opinion of hezek ri'iyah, lashme hezek. And as we discussed in the past, even if you're of the opinion that hezek ri'iyah is not a hezek, nonetheless, it doesn't mean you're saying it doesn't exist. You're just saying it doesn't have any legal validity. Nonetheless, it exists as a fact. And therefore, there's still the logic of people seeing into my property. And therefore, logically, I care less about what people see in my field than what they see in my garden. So I think this applies, even if you say hezek ri'iyah, lashme hezek, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm just pointing that out. Meaning, I'll tell you why I'm pointing this out. Let's go a little further, because when the Gemara mentioned earlier, when the Gemara earlier quoted this Mishnah which said v'chein begina, and the Gemara asked that the word v'chein implies that the same halacha of the chatzar applies to the Gina. And the Gemara therefore asked, well, what kind of issue is there in Gina? Meaning, if according to you, hezek ri'iyah lashme hezek, and the only reason why you're building the wall is because the two of you have agreed to build the wall, then what's the difference? Chatzar, Gina, here, there. If you agree to build a wall, you build a wall. What's the difference where it is? So v'chein begina implies that there's a special unique halacha that is taught to us by chatzar, and that same thing applies to a Gina. And the Gemara therefore said, seemingly, what the Mishnah is saying is that hezek ri'iyah that we told about it by chatzar also applies to Gina. And the Gemara answered and said, no, the issue there is, I'm sorry. And the Gemara therefore said then, right, the Gemara therefore said, no, a Gina is different because of ayin hara. People see my garden growing and it's ayin hara, right? So the Gemara therefore said that according to the opinion which says hezek ri'iyah lashme hezek, there's still an issue of people seeing in my garden because of ayin hara. Could that be read into this Rashi? Afal pisha hezek ri'iyah kasha. It's worse than bika because what? Why is the visual in Gina worse than bika? Because like Tosafos said there's more ayin hara in Gina than bika, because bika happens less often. Remember Tosafos said that? Is that what Rashi means here? I don't think you have to go that way. I think you could just say, even if you're of the opinion, hezek ri'iyah lashme hezek, still the fact remains, people see my property and it's uncomfortable. Whether the halacha considers that something that's of a monetized damage is a separate question. But I think even if you're of the opinion that you don't pay for hezek ri'iyah, it's still a fact that exists. I think. Just pointing that out. Okay, so we're back to the Gemara's question. The Gemara's question is the two unqualified statements of the Mishnah. The Mishnah stated by Ginah that the only time you obligate the person to build the wall is if there's an actual custom. If there's no custom, you don't have to build it. When it came to Bika, the Mishnah said, that the only time you don't have to build a wall by a Bika is if there's a positive custom not to. But if there's no custom, then you should go ahead and build, which would mean, therefore, a locale that has no custom, neither by Gina, neither by Bika, the halacha would be, in the Bika you build a wall, in the Gina you don't build a wall. And that's obviously doesn't sound logical, as Rashi points out, because hezek ri'iyah and a Gina is worse. So it says the Gemara like this. Amar Abai says, Hakika Amar. This is what the Mishnah means to say, and this is how you should read it. V'chein stam Gina, add the word stam. When it says v'chein begina, add the word stam. So v'chein, the same law applies, that you have to build a wall between two people applies in a location where there's no minhag. It's a stam gina. It's a gina without a minhag. It's a gina without a local custom. And then, and then end of statement. Now, new statement. Ubemakim shenagu ligder bebika mechayvenoisai. And in a place where there's a custom to build a wall by a bika, then you obligate them. So how do you read this Gemara then? How do you read this? How do you read the Mishnah? Let's look at Rashi here. Let's make sure we're clear on this Gemara before we go to the Rashi even. Abaye is telling us you have to add the word stam before the word gina, which means therefore when the Mishnah says v'chein begina, that itself applies to a gina, to a garden that has no specific local custom. And therefore the halacha you learned by the chatzar, like you have to build a wall between two properties. V'chein bestam gina also applies to a place where there's no custom in a garden. Now there's a second clause in the Mishnah, which goes on. The Mishnah goes on to say and says that by bika, in the place where there's no custom, that's when you don't build. Right? So how do we read that? So therefore, the next statement in the Mishnah, which reads, that's not applying to the gina, but rather it's applying to bika. So let's learn Rashi. Amar Abaye Cholum.
The aval in the Mishnah is very shver.
Oh, that's what the Gemara is going to ask. So good. You're reading it right, if that's your question. That's going to be the Gemara's question. Let's see how Rashi plays this out. Hi, Amicha. Nice to see you. So let's see Rashi. Hi, Makim. Amar Abaye Cholo. Hi, Makim. Shenagu ligdar the katanim. When the Mishnah talks about a location that has a custom, a positive custom to build a wall, is not talking about the gina, but the katanim masnisim, but it's talking about a bika. So the statement in the Mishnah which talks about a place that has a custom to build a wall is not talking about the garden, but talking about the bika. So put the period after v'chein begina, period, adding the word stam. Now the halacha of chatzar, building a wall between two properties, also applies to a gina which has no custom. And then makom shenagu, to build a wall by a bika, you build a wall, and a place where there is no custom to build a wall by the bika, you don't build a wall. Okay, so if it's not clear, please interrupt me. Now the Gemara asks exactly Aaron's question. Amar le Rava. Rava tells Abaye, in Cain, if that's the case, my aval. What's the word aval doing here? As Aaron points out. So let's go back to the Mishnah. I want to read the Mishnah, you'll see. Well, first let's learn the Rashi actually. One second, let's see the Rashi. In Cain, my aval bebika. What's the aval doing by bika, says Rashi? Haminei solik. You just, according to Abaye, where the words in the Mishnah which says, Malkim shenago ligda, a place that has a custom, is not talking about a gina, but it's talking about a bika, then that's what you were just talking about. So what are you saying aval for? Aval means but. When you say the word but, it means you're switching the case. This is one case, but this is another case. Or the halacha in this case is such, but the halacha in such case is such. So when you say the word but, when you say the word aval, you're switching what the case is. But in Abaye's reading, where you're putting a period after the word gina, v'chein bestam gina period, and then the next word, makom shenagu ligdar, is talking about a place that has a custom to build a wall by a bika, then what's the word aval doing there? You're talking about the same case in the next line. Haminei solik, you're talking about a bika. Why are you putting the word aval, says Rashi? V'hachi boil listening. And this is what I should have read. Aval makom shenagu ligdar. Okay, so let's see the Rashi, see the Mishnah and see what Rashi is trying to say. Let's go to the Mishnah. Look at the first page, Beis Amud Aleph. Look at the Mishnah. And let's read it like Abaye. And let's read it the way Rashi is telling us that Rava is asking what Abaye should do, according to Abaye. Now, v'chein begina. Sorry, let's read it like Abaye. So v'chein bestam gina. In the same way, you just finished telling us you have to build a wall between a chatzar that was split. Same thing is true of a garden, even if there's no custom, because it's a stam gina. Now, period. Now, Makim Shinago Ligdar Bibika, a place, Makim Shinago Ligdar Mechavin, a place where there's a custom to build a wall, you're obligated to build it. Bibika, when it comes to a bika. Aval, but, Makim Shinago Shalai Ligdar Ein Mechavin. The word aval should be placed after the word bika. That's the way Rashi read it. Without Rashi, by the way, I just want to make sure this is clear. If you're looking at the Mishnah in Beis Amud Aleph, in Abaye's view, where the words Makim Shnagol Ligdar Mechavin apply to a bika, then the word aval should be after the word bika. Makim Shnagol Ligdar Mechavin bika, a place where there's a custom to build a wall, we do so when there's a bika, even in a bika. Aval, but the place where there's no custom, you don't build. Right? But the aval doesn't belong by bika. Now, that's the way Rashi is telling us the question. Before I learned Rashi, I thought the Gemara was asking like this. I'm just wondering why Rashi goes this way, not the other way. I thought that he was asking as follows. V'chein as well. V'chein begina. The same thing is true of a one second. V'chein b'stam begina. Makim shnogu. Right. Okay. You can put the word. It's better the way Rashi did it. Obviously. Never mind. As I'm reading it now, I see that the way I was thinking was incorrect. So you can delete that. Okay. So this is the Gemara's question, and Rava's question on Abaye, that the word aval is misplaced because we're not switching the case here. According to Abaye, where the period comes after the word gina, and makim shenagol ligdar begins the clause of bika, then the word aval doesn't belong there because the word aval implies is switching cases. The word aval belongs after the word bika, in which you switch from a bika that has a custom to build to a bika that has no custom to build. And that's where the word aval should be. And therefore, says the Gemara, Ela Marava, we're back on Daled Amud Aleph. 1, 2, 3, 8 lines from the bottom. Second word, Ela Marava. Rather, Rava says, Hachikotani. This is how you should read the Mishnah. V'chein stam gina. The same thing is true of a regular place, and he has another word, kim makam. When the Mishnah says that the same halacha applies to a gina, that you build a wall, and the Mishnah goes on to say a place where the custom is to build, you build a wall, you should add the letter kaf, which means like, meaning like this. That the same halacha that we said by a chatzar, where you build a wall between two partners that split, the same thing is true of a garden. We consider it as if it's a place that has a minhag. Kim makom shenagu. And therefore gets that halacha. Kim makom shenagu ligdar dami u'machayven oisei. Aval, but stam bika kim makom shenagu shloi ligdar. But add the word stam and ke again. But a bika that has no custom, we treat it as if it's a place that it doesn't have that has a custom not to. The ein machayven oisei is not machayev. So he switches both clauses. He adds the word stam and the letter kaf, saying like this, that when the Mishnah says that by a gina, you build a wall, the Mishnah doesn't just mean that if the custom is to build a wall, you build a wall. The Mishnah means to say like this, if there is no custom, treat it as if it has a custom and build a wall. And then when the Mishnah says by bika, that if there is no custom, if there is a positive custom not to, don't, it doesn't just mean that. It doesn't just mean that when there's a custom not to, you shouldn't. What it means is that if you found a bika that has no custom, treat it as if it had a custom not to. That's the way Rava reads the Gemara. Okay? Which seems rather clear. If it's not, please chime in. Now, before we go to Tosafos, I want to learn the first half of the Maharsha, which I sent you. It's in the third picture I sent you in the WhatsApp. If you have it in the back, it's the Maharsha in the back of your Gemara. Because what the Maharsha does is he explains why Tosafos rejects Rashi's interpretation. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn the Maharsha, which explains why Tosafos rejects Rashi's interpretation. Then we'll learn the Tosafos. And then we'll go back to the Maharsha to see how the Tosafos would defend his position against a virtue that Rashi's position has. So we're going Maharsha, first half Maharsha, Tosafos, and then back to the Maharsha. So again, it's the third picture I have in the WhatsApp group. If you're looking at the Gemara, if you're looking in your actual book, it's in the Maharsha on the back. the one and only Marsha on Daf Dalid Amad Aleph. So Tosafos says like this. The Marsha says like this. Mishum de Kashelahu. Tosafos has the following question, which compels him to introduce another pshat in the Gemara. What's the question that's compelling Tosafos? The hashtanami tikshid yukaderesha. Right now, in Abaye's view, you're still stuck with the original question the Gemara asked. But now you're going to ask it not in the first clause, but you'll ask it in the second clause. Right? The yukaderesha, the ka'amar. The question you asked in the first clause, which the Gemara asked, the Mishnah asked, the Gemara asked like this, right? The Gemara said that when the Mishnah said that a stam gina, the Mishnah said that a gina that has a custom to build, you build, which meant that if there's no custom at all, it's a stam gina, don't build. And then the Mishnah went on to say that a bika that has a positive minhag not to, nagu shaloi ligder, don't build. But if there's no custom, then build. Implying that a stam gina don't build, stam bika yes build, which seemed to be irrational. So how did Abaye answer the question? By saying that what the Mishnah means is that the same thing is true of a stam gina period. And then by a bika, in Abaye's view, that would mean the bika has two clauses in the Mishnah. The first clause is when there's a positive, right? In Abaye's reading, both when the Mishnah says makom shenagol ligder and when the Mishnah says makom shenagol shaloi ligder is both talking about a bika in Abaye's view. So Abaye's view is that the bika has two clauses. The first clause says in Abaye's reading, the first clause says that if there's no minhag by a bika, don't build. The first clause says that if there's a minhag by a bika to build, then build. Second clause says, in Abaye's reading, that if there's a minhag not to build by a bika, don't build. So what do you do by a case where there isn't any minhag at all? In Abaye's reading, the Mishnah doesn't address that. The Mishnah does not address in Abaye's question, Abaye's reading at this moment. The Mishnah does not address what is the halacha by a stam bika. Because you have two clauses by a stam by bika in Abaye's reading. Either the Mishnah is talking about a makom shenagol ligder, where there's a positive minhag to build, or the Mishnah is talking about a bika which has a positive minhag not to build. What if it's stam bika? It doesn't say. So if you look at the first clause, which says you build when you have a positive minhag to build, you would assume no minhag, don't build. The second clause, which says when there's a minhag not to build, don't build, the implication is that there's no custom. Go ahead, don't build. Because the only time go ahead and build. Because the only time you don't build is when you have a minhag not to. If it's not clear, please interrupt me. The point is that the two clauses, which the Gemara saw as irrational, because one was talking about a ginah and one was talking about a bika, now the same irrationality, the same ambiguity is just both by a bika. Because the Mishnah says two clauses by a bika now, according to Abaye. One when there's a positive minhag to build, and one when there's a positive minhag not to build. What about stam bika? Mishnah doesn't say. And looking at the first clause, you come one conclusion. Looking at the other clause, you've come to the other conclusion. So because of this, Tosafos has to give another reading, has to add, or maybe change. We have to think about whether he's arguing with Rashi or not. But he has to add some detail. Because right now, the Gemara did not answer its own question. It just pushed what's the expression? You kick it down the road. You just passed it down to the next point. The same question now applies, but just to the bika instead of bika versus gina. Let's see how the Marsha articulates that. Mishum de kashelahu, because the Tosafos, had the following question. You still have the same question, even in Abaye's reading. The first clause in Abaye's reading of the Mishnah, which is talking about a bika, which says, that when there's a positive custom to build by a bika, you build it. That's the first clause of the Mishnah according to Abaye. Hastama, but if you have no custom, don't build it. And that contradicts Adyuka de Seifa, how you would be reading from the second clause of bika. Tikatani, where we learn, a place where the custom is not to build, the bika by bika, you don't. Hastam, but if you have no custom, so you build it. And therefore, as Tosafos is going to, as Mashal is going to go on, therefore Tosafos has to introduce a new level of pshat. So now let's go to Tosafos and see what he adds to avoid this question the Mashal just articulated for us. Okay, again, if I'm not clear, please interrupt me. So let's go to Tosafos. Now we're back on Daled and Aleph. Hachikatani. First he quotes Abaye, which says, to put the period, add the word stam and put a period. Hachikatani v'chein begina stam, period. So let's remove the word avol, because the Gemara had the problem with the word avol. And the way the Mishnah would be read now, according to Abaye, is that the halacha of a chatzar we have to build between two partners also applies to a ginah, even if there's no custom. Now, when it comes to a bika, there's two clauses. Clause number one is that if you have a minig, build a wall. And clause number two is, if there's a minig not to, don't build. So says Tosafos, the sefer nami yesh tefare came. You have to also add these caveats, this words, v'chein, bestam, and put a period. You also have to add that to the second clause, which is like this. Avo stam bika, but also a stam bika, and the place where you have no custom, where you have a custom not to, begina in mechayv noisai. You have to add a whole bunch of words now. Let's go to the Mishnah and see how you would read it according to Tosafos, the way he's answering Abaye. Let's look at the Mishnah. And if you have it like, you can see the Tosafos parallel like this. Okay, you kind of fold your book halfway. You can see both same time, the Tosafos and the Mishnah. Let's learn the Mishnah. The Mishnah begins with the chatzar that you have to split the property and you build a wall. Okay. Then it says like this: "V'chein b'stam gina." Says Abaye is reading according to Tosafos. "V'chein b'stam gina." The same thing is true by a gina that has no custom. You also have to build a wall. Period. Now, a place which has a custom to build by a bika, we make him build a bika. Avol but, put in the word avol after bika. Avol but. Stam bika. A bika that has no custom. Makim shenagu. And a place where they have a custom. Shaloy ligda not to build. Begina by a gina. And you don't obligate him to. Adding a lot of words. But in this way, there's no contradiction between the clauses. And every case is covered. So you're adding a lot of words to the Mishnah, making it a very difficult reading, but at least you avoided the question of the Marsha there, which is that the case of stam bika isn't covered. Because now we're at the same way we added the word stam before the word gina, and say that v'chein b'stam gina, the same halacha of a chatzar applies to a stam gina, you add the word v'chein b'stam bika. And the same thing is true of a stam bika, goes like a case which has no custom. And the same thing is true of a gina that has a definitive custom not to, also you don't build. We're adding a lot of details, but this is the way Tosafos avoids this. Okay, so I hope that was clear. If it's not, again, interrupt me. Now it's back to the Marsha.
All this adding of different words this way, that way, the other way, doesn't that all run contrary to the Mishnah being as succinct as possible?
Well, yes and no, because on the face of it, you're right, correct. It's correct. And ordinarily, the Gemara very much tries to avoid doing these kinds of things, adding words to the Mishnah. But we also have to remember that the Mishnah is, at the end of the day, even though it's edited by Yehuda Nasi, all texts up until the end of the age of the Gemara are all notes. Nothing was ever written as a book. It's all notes. And therefore, you never know what the person writing the notes meant when they wrote the notes. Now, when it comes to Mishnah and Gemara, you rely on the editors, that the editors put it together into a coherent fashion, right? So, for example, the Gemara will have no problem adding or taking out words of a Braisa or Tosefta, even though those are also edited by the Rashi and others, but nonetheless, they're not as scrupulously edited as the Mishnah. But at the end of the day, still, the Mishnah is still notes of somebody, and if we have no choice because the questions are too strong, the Gemara will do this, even though we wouldn't. But that's the context in which this happens, because it's people's notes. It's not like a book a person wrote from beginning to end. note that were later added.
Although some of it you could say is intentional in terms of it was meant to be oral, and when it was written down, it was coded, and so that it wouldn't be accessible to everyone.
Yeah, so there's a historian that I like to listen to, and he makes that point. He says that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he wrote the Mishnah, was faced with the challenge of, number one, he had to write down the oral law, but at the same time, he also had to retain its oral nature. So if he were to write a decisive code, then he would have ended the conversation of the oral tradition. So he dafke wrote a code with no conclusions, right? There's no conclusions in the Mishnah. It's machlekes, no conclusions. Well, what do I do? So it's much more of a transcript of conversation specifically to invite later generations to keep on the conversation. So that could be part of this as well. Okay, so let's go to the Marsha now. Now, we saw Marsha's question, and therefore Mashum Hachi, therefore Hutzu Cholemar, therefore the Tosafos was compelled. We're back to the same place we left off in the Marsha. Hutzu Cholemar, therefore the Tosafos were compelled to be safe for Nami Yesh the Parich Cain. At the end, you also have to add this, Aval Stam Bika, etc. Now the question becomes, according to Tosafos' reading, what's wrong with the word Aval? You're anyways moving all the words around. What's wrong with the word Aval? Like, what's the problem? You're adding words, moving words. Okay, so the word Aval is not exactly where it's supposed to be. Move it around. But so Marsha needs to defend that. So Marsha therefore says, Rava Shaper Kamakshale. But however, Rava is still asking a good question by asking, what's the Aval doing there? My Aval. Why? Even the Beredation, Nami Bika Solukle, Havalamima Aval Bika. He should have put the word Aval before the word Bika. And then Aval Stam. So this is what I was thinking before, which you'll see why it doesn't work as well. So let's look in the Mishnah again to see where we put the word Aval. When Rabbi asked this question, what did Rashi say? Rashi said, take the word Aval and put it after the word Bika. Right? Right. When Rashi asked the question of Aval, Rashi said that we're putting the word Aval after Bika, right? So look at the Mishnah. Let's see how Rashi did it. How Rashi was saying, Rabbi was telling Abaye how you should have read the Mishnah. V'chein b'stam Ginah, period. Now, Malcolm Shanago lived there. A place where you have a custom to build by a Bika, build it. Aval, but a place which has no Bika, which has a custom not to, don't build. All talking about a Bika, but the switch in the Aval is from a place that has a minhag to a place that has a minhag not to. Now the Marsha is saying that Rava's question is different because the whole reading is different according to Rashi, according to Tosafos. And Tosafos therefore saying that the Aval should have been put after the words v'chein begina. V'chein b'stam gina. The same thing is true of a stam gina, where the halacha follows a chatzar. Aval b'bika, makom shnago live there. Take the whole aval and the word bika and put it earlier. Because from there going forward is all about bika in Tosafos' view. And you're adding two clauses to bika. And you're giving explanation to the clauses. That b'chein b'stam bika, and so on and so forth. So the whole aval b'bika should have been put at the beginning, right after the words b'chein b'stam gina. That's the way the Marsha is understanding the question of Rava according to Tosafos. Because moving the aval one word over wouldn't help according to Tosafos, since he's rearranging the whole second clause to begin with it all. Now this in essence makes more sense. First talk about a gina, and then switch chords aval b'bika, and talk about all the halachas of bika. This makes sense. Now we might say, okay, I hope this is clear, but if it's not, please interrupt me. Now, looking at Rashi again. I'm not sure. There's a lot to be wanting in Rashi. How he deals with the Marsha's question on that Tosafos is trying to avoid. Why he doesn't go with this?
The Marsha says the aval should be moved somewhere else.
That the word aval and bika should have been moved right after the word v'chein wistam ginah. See it? How remember aval b'bika and then ella aval b'stam. That's what it seems like. As opposed to putting the word aval. In other words, Rashi is making the word aval should have been to switch between the two clauses of bika. And the Marsha is saying the question is, put the aval before bika when you're switching from stam to bika, from gina to bika. And then all the other things will flow because you're still talking about bika. Whereas Rashi said the question is to put the aval between the two cases of bika. Bika where there's no minig, or bika where there's a minig to build, and bika where there's a minig not to build. Yeah. So we have to go back to Rashi and see again how this would work out, but I'm just putting these issues and questions on the table. Okay, let's go weiter. Weiter in the Gemara. If something's not clear, this would be a good point to ask, because we're about to go forward in the Gemara. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. The last word on the 7th line. So the Mishnah concluded with the halacha. The last halacha in the Mishnah was, or second to last halacha is, that a person who wants to build a wall by a bika, where you're not obligated to build one, then build it on your side. Right? Ella imratza. If you want, you can go into your property, ubayna, and build. But you want to protect yourself so that years later when the wall falls, they know it belongs to you. And therefore the Mishnah said, Oisa chazis, you build a mark, you make a mark, which indicates that the wall belongs to you because you built it. And that no one should come, your neighbor shouldn't come and claim later, we built it 50-50. So you build a chazis. So the Gemara asks, my chazis, what's a chazis mean? Omar Rav Huna says, Akafdele lekarnen, he bends, karnen means like the horn, the top, levar to the outside. You bend the top facing outward. The top of the wall is built outward, away from your property. Says Rashi, Mekafdele lekarnen levar, Rashi hakoisel, the head of the wall, Yachav l'tzad chaverei, should be bent to the side of his friend. Okay, so there's a period there, as you can see, because at this point, Rashi finished commenting on the Gemara, just translating what the words mean. Mekafi l'kain levar. He bends the top of the wall to the side of his friend. So, like the nicer side, as if I guess I'm not sure why one way is better than the other. The Gemara is going to discuss a little bit, but anyway, this is the way everyone says it. You bend the wall pointing outward, away from you. Levar means on the outside. So now Rashi feels compelled to tell us what the word chazis means. What does the word chazis mean? Even though in the Mishnah, he didn't say what the word chazis means. Not translate the word chazis. Actually, he said the word mefarish begemara. The Gemara is going to explain. Okay, so what does the word chazis mean? How does chazis land in the translation of bending the end? So it says like this: B'chol chazis. Anytime the word chazis appears, loshin katza. It means an edge or the end. And Rashi gives two examples of other places where the word chazis is used, and the implication is end. And as we're going to see, it's mamish not clear that the other cases actually mean end. Which is interesting that Rashi gives two examples that are itself somewhat contentious. But so I'm just going to read it and put the questions on the table because I thought about it today and I'm not sure where to go, what he means. Okay. Now, I'm going to put out other questions as well that I have on this little Rashi here. Okay, every chazis means an edge. The same thing we find in Masechta Tamid, where there it describes one of the koyanim and one of the work they did in the Beis Mikdash. Right, the Tamid talks about the morning procedure in the Beis Mikdash, or just Tamid means like continuous, right? The carbon Tamid, it's the procedure. So it talks about one of the koyanim who his lottery was to do this avodah. He would go up and set the maracha. The maracha is one of the fires. There's a few fires in the Mizbeach, and one of the fires that they had to be set up in the morning. And the way it was built it was on the eastern end of the Mizbeach, and it was built in a kind of square. And on one side, there were like two long sticks or logs that would come out of that fire, attaching to the central fire on the center of the Mizbeach. Okay, so there it says, Gaba Maracha, with respect to the fire built, V'chazisa, and its chazis, says the Mishnah in Talmud, Mizracha is on the east. And the Mishnah concludes, Rosh HaGrizin, the heads of the logs on the other end, reach out to the central pile. So over there you see the word chazis means end. The chazisa, its end is Mizrach, is on the east. The Rashi, but the head of it, the other side goes to the Rosh HaGrizin, the head of the head of the logs on the other side reach to the central fire on the center of the Mizbeach. Example number 1 of the word chazis, meaning edge. Example 2, and likewise the Malachim in Malachim Aleph Zayin Pasuk Hey. The pasuk is describing the palace of Shlomo HaMelech in great detail, and there it says that there was a chazah opposite a chazah. Each chazah was opposite each other. What's a chazah opposite each other? Rosh HaNasarim, the heads of the nasar is like a plank of wood or a beam. The head of the beam, misubin, is bent or facing zemul zeh, this opposite that one. So 2 examples of the word chazis being used to mean end. One by the maracha, chazisa, the edge of the maracha, the edge of the fire is on mizrach, and the other one is the 2 edges of the beams, mechza, mul mechza, one end pointing the other end, facing each other. Okay, so now look at the pictures I sent you, and you'll see how both of these sources are not conclusive that chazis means an edge, which to me is very interesting. So let's look at the first one first. So it's the third. The 4th and 5th picture I sent you, where it says Biur Mishnah Daled. So this comes from Mishnayos Kahati, which is a wonderful, wonderful commentary on the Mishnah. The most basic, want to read Mishnah and understand on its basic level, Mishnayos Kahati. Whoever wrote it is going olam. It's amazing. Okay, so the Mishnah says like this: Seder Maracha Gdola, the order of the one who makes the big fire. Hakohen Shezach B'Tumas Hadeshen. See the kohen whose job it is to remove the old ashes. He also set up the big bonfire. Is explained in the previous Mishnah. Now, where was this Marach Avdela set up? Mizracha. It's side Mizrach Shel Mizbeach, on the eastern side of Mizbeach. V'chazisa, and the chazis, whatever that is, Shel Maracha, of this bonfire. Mizracha, Klape Mizrach, is facing towards east. So there's like a redundancy here. It said the Maracha is set up on the Mizrach, and then it says Chazisa Mizracha. So what's this chazis we're talking about? So Koloimar means to say, Sha'oisim Maracha Ke'ein Chaloin, you make in the bonfire a kind of window, Mitzad Mizrach, facing the eastern side. So this is a Mafarish and the Rosh Rabbeinu Gershom. The Rosh, the Mafarish, and the Gershom, how do they translate the word chazis? Not as edge, but as window. That the Maracha had a window at facing the end, right? Because it actually makes sense in the reading of the Mishnah. Because the Mishnah says the Maracha Gdela, the big bonfire, is on the east. And then it says Chazisa Mizracha, and the Chazis is on the east. So this Chazis is another thing that's on the east, in addition to the fire being on the east. What's this other thing? It's a window. The Gemara explains the reason when Hashem is brought that the wind should blow into it, and to inflame the bonfire. Others say the reason why there's a window is in order to light other sticks from it. Okay, that's one opinion. Yesh mefarshim, others explain. What's the chazisa b'mizracha? What does it mean that the chazis is on the mizrach, not a window? But you make some sort of sign in the building of the bonfire on the eastern side, to all those who see, so everybody can see that there's a certain anomaly, a certain sign, a certain way it's built that indicates to you, an indicator, which indicate to you that when you structure the bonfire, you do so starting from the east. So the second interpretation sounds like chazisa means edge, right? In other words, the chazis mizracha, the edge is where you start, and that's where you make the sign to show that it's the edge. Right? That's consistent with our translation, our mission of chazis, that you're using the edge to make a sign that belongs to you. So by the Marach also, the Rambam's reading, and I suppose same thing is true would be of Rashi, is that the end of the Maracha has a chazis, has a sign at the edge to point that this is where you started from. But you can see there's another translation, which is window, which makes it itself a little bit controversial. Rashi's bringing this as like a reason. Okay. Now, before we go to the other example, I want to point out something interesting about this example too. Rashi wants to tell us that the word chazis means edge. What does Rashi, look at the Rashi, what does he quote? Rashi Agrizim is the first words of the next clause of the Mishnah. You can go back to the picture we saw there. That the heads of the inner logs on the other end were touching the big mound. It was called tapuach, but the big mound, the big fire in the middle. So Rashi quotes. In other words, if he's trying to prove that chazis means edge, all he should have quoted was the chazis and mizracha. And the chazis is on the east. Period. What's he adding these two words, Rashi Agrizim, which is the beginning of the next clause? That doesn't even go on to explain. Why are those two words quoted here? Just pointing that out there. Unless somehow the way you understand Rashi, Hagrizim, proves what the translation of mechza is, which is what I was thinking, but I'm not 100% convinced. That maybe Rashi is pointing to you that the Mishnah is speaking of the two ends, right? It says chazis, one end, and rosh, the other end. Right? In other words, as in like one side is called the rosh, and then the edge of it is called the chazis. And that's why it's quoting both sides, to tell you that the word chazis, even if it means window, is in contrast to the rosh, which is on the other side. Maybe that's why he's quoting that second half. I'm just putting it out there. I'm just showing you how it's not mamash so pashut. You see other translations to the word chazis, means a window. And number two, Rashi is quoting these extra two words here. What's this about? Okay, now let's go to the other example. The example of...
He doesn't quote the vav, Rasha. He just says Rasha.
Exactly, it doesn't even quote the vav, yes. Also good point, not quote the vav.
In the Kahati, who's the Mefarish?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's named after him. His name is Pinchas Kahati.
No. He's asking in the parentheses on the first picture. One of the sources for the translation of chazis as a window is Hamafarish. I'm not sure what that is.
Okay,
so now look at the first two pictures I sent you, which is the source for the pasuk in Malachim. So let's ignore the English translation because I think they're wrong. This comes from Sefaria. The first picture. So we have the pasuk which says, "V'chol ha'psachim," and all the openings, mezuzahs and the doorposts, revuim shakif, were squared in their framing. Mul mechza al mechza shalish pamim, and one mechza was opposite another mechza, one chazis opposite another chazis, 3 times. Okay, so what does this mean? It says Rashi. Looking at the commentary on the bottom, this is Rashi. In the first picture I said, umul mechza, umul shel mechza. The direction of the mechza, mesev, is pointing l'kras mechza acheres, to the other mechza. What's that? Rosh haneser, the edge of the beam, l'kras rosh haneser, pointing the edge of the other beam. Right. So here Rashi translates the word mechza as rosh, as a head. Again, pointing to Rashi Agrizim. I'm not sure. I'm just telling you. Rashi translates the word mechza as rosh, the edge. And again, shalosh polim b'chol tikra, each beam had it 3 times. I'm not sure how each beam had it 3 times. That's what Rashi concludes. But scroll to the next picture I sent you and look at the Pirush of the Metzudas David, translating the same pasuk. What does he say? Umul mechza el mechza, kamoi umechza el mul mechza. Right? He rearranges the words of the pasuk. It says umul mechza, and opposite the mechza, el mechza to a mechza. It should say umechza, and the mechza is el mul, is to the opposite of mechza, the other mechza. The rotzolaimer means to say hachaloin shebe'ever hazeh, the window which is on this side, hayamul hachaloin shebe'ever hazeh, is opposite the window of the other side. So here you see also in both cases Rashi quotes, there's another translation to the word chazis, and both of them mean the exact same thing, window. It's quite remarkable. Now, what I'd like to do tomorrow, when I get to MTC, We have a book called the Concordinitza, which Concordinitza takes the words of Tanakh and tells you where else in the entire Tanakh you can find the same word. So you can put it in context and come with some good translation. So I would like to look up the word chazis and see where else in Tanakh is there chazis, and do we have the same machlekes, edge versus window? And maybe, I mean, just to see why Rashi chooses these ones, like, which are themselves controversial. Anyway, it's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Unless these two things flow, chazisa mizracha Rashi agrees in. We're talking about the two edges, and therefore the word chazisa is the same thing as Rashi, and therefore the word mechza means Rashi and Asarim. Maybe that's what Rashi's trying to do here. Not sure, but I'm just pointing it out. Okay, I think we'll stop over here because the Gemara is about to begin a pilpul about why would you make it you inward, or why would you make a point outward to your neighbor? Why not make a point inward to your side where you have more control? And then the Gemara goes on to discuss how you prevent your neighbor from just mimicking your chazis and basically stealing from you. How do you prevent that? I make it bend to his side and he'll make it bend to my side. And then he'll claim it's both of ours, right? Because the Mishnah said that if you have chazis on both sides, it belongs to both of you. Right? So how do you prevent the other guy from making a chazis and just completely dismantling your claim that it's all yours? That's a whole pilpul coming with Hashem next week on Wednesday. Tomorrow, I'm really looking forward to learning the Rebbe's Haggadah.